You know that thing called buyer's remorse? It's a feeling of regret after having made a purchase, especially an expensive one. And in the tech world, it's extremely easy to come across this feeling because of how fast everything develops. Back in March this year when I was still building my machine, I bought an i7-8700K, which I thought would offer unparalleled performance for a long time. Soon after I completed my build though, rumors started showing up describing a consumer 9th gen CPU with 8 cores and 16 threads. While the i7-8700K was still a great CPU, I couldn't stop thinking that if I had waited just a bit longer, I could have had a better machine. Fast forward a few months, and we now have two 8-core CPUs from Intel, the i7-9700K and the i9-9900K. And holy crap! Look at those prices. That is a lot of dollars. Is that even worth it? Are either of these CPUs an intelligent buy? Let's find out. Alright, I apologize if this video is a little long because there's quite a lot to cover. The first thing I'll be talking about are the new CPUs and the new Z390 platform. I'll also be doing some performance comparisons between them and previous range-topping consumer Intel and AMD chips, a performance per dollar analysis, and finally, who I think should buy these CPUs. Intel's 9th generation processors are codenamed Coffee Lake, which is a refresh of the 8th generation, weirdly also codenamed Coffee Lake, which was a refresh of 7th generation Kaby Lake, which was a refresh of 6th generation Skylake. The i5-9600K has 6 cores and 6 threads with a base clock of 3.7 GHz, a max turbo of 4.6, and an all-core boost of 4.3. This is pretty much unchanged from last generation's 8600K, except the slightly higher clocks. The i7 and i9 processors are more exciting though. The 9700K has 8 cores and 8 threads, with a base clock of 3.6 GHz, a max turbo of 4.9, and an all-core boost of 4.6. The i9-9900K has 8 cores and 16 threads, with a base clock of 3.6 GHz, a max turbo of 5 GHz, and an all-core boost of 4.7. Their competition for today are the Ryzen 5 2600X and the Ryzen 7 2700X. The Ryzen 5 2600X is a 6-core 12-thread chip with a base clock of 3.6 GHz and a max turbo of 4.2. The Ryzen 7 2700X is an 8-core 16-thread chip with a base clock of 3.7 GHz and a max turbo of 4.3. One big change for the 9th generation is the soldered TIM, or thermal interface material. 8th generation CPUs like this one used a grease-based material which was pretty bad at transferring heat from the CPU die, which is the part that makes all the heat, to the IHS, or integrated heat spreader, which is the thing that transfers the heat to whatever cooling solution is fitted to the CPU. The soldered TIM allows the CPU to transfer its heat faster and run cooler than the 8th gen chips, which in turn allows them to run at higher base and boost clocks. It also increases their overclocking capabilities, but that also really depends on what chip you get. This is something called the silicon lottery. No chip is created equal, and some overclock better than others. My i7-8700K is one of the worst ones. Most 8700Ks are able to hit 5 GHz stable on all the cores, while mine only hits 4.7 stable on all the cores at 1.35 volts. And that's with a 280mm liquid cooler. All these 9th gen CPUs were launched with a new Z390 platform, which brings integrated USB 3.1 Gen 2, woo! 10 gigabits per second! And integrated AC Wi-Fi. But wait a minute! This Z370 Gaming Pro Carbon from MSI does have USB 3.1 Gen 2, and its Wi-Fi version does have AC Wi-Fi support. So what's up with that? Well, this was achieved using a separate controller added to select boards. The Z370 chipset, though, does not actually support them. Z390, on the other hand, used the chipset itself to handle USB 3.1 Gen 2 and AC Wi-Fi. The only problem with the Intel platform is the upgrade path. Every 2 generations, the CPU socket changes. Take Coffee Lake for example, 8th generation I'm talking about though. Even with the 8th generation Coffee Lake being a refresh of Kaby Lake and Skylake, even if their sockets are physically identical, Intel changed the pinouts of the socket, forcing consumers who want to upgrade from their 6th or 7th generation CPUs to buy a new motherboard as well. The Ryzen platform doesn't have this problem. AMD promised that the current AM4 socket will be supporting future Ryzen processors until 2020. So if you've got a B450 board for your Ryzen 5 2600 and you're hoping to upgrade to maybe the Ryzen 7 4700X in the future, you do have the option. How do these new CPUs perform against their competition though? The instructions per clock, or IPC, for the last 4 generations of Intel CPUs, Coffee Lake Refresh, Coffee Lake, Kaby Lake, and Skylake, are the same because the microarchitectures are pretty much identical. So single-threaded performance of the 9th gen chips will be slightly better than their 8th gen counterparts because of their slightly higher turbo clock speeds. For multi-threaded performance, the 9900K has 2 more cores than the 8700K, which means it'll be around 33% faster, which is a pretty significant jump. The i7 9700K though is a weird one. While it does have 2 more cores than the i7 8700K, it doesn't have hyper-threading, so you win some here but you lose some there. As it turns out, the benefits of having 2 more physical cores are cancelled out by the lack of threads, which results in the 9700K performing actually pretty closely to the 8700K. The 9600K performs pretty closely to its older sibling, the 8600K, as well. On the Ryzen side of things, I'll be comparing the 9900K and the 9700K to the 2700X, and the 9600K to the 2600X. For single-threaded performance, all the new 9th gen CPUs destroy them. Not only are the IPCs of these chips slightly higher than the Ryzen's, but their max turbos are close to 1 GHz higher. For multi-threaded workloads, the i9 9900K is much faster than the 2700X, but by a narrower margin. The 9700K loses to it though because of its lack of threads. The multi-core performance of the 2700X is roughly in the middle of the 9900K and the 9700K. The 9600K though is not even close to the 2600X here. Just a little side note, I also want to discuss how to get the best performance out of these CPUs because AMD and Intel CPUs behave differently. On Ryzen's, it's not a common sight for an all-core overclock to reach the max turbo frequency with a stock cooler. Of course, if you have aftermarket cooling, you could probably do it with ease, but that increases the cost by about $50 to $100 depending on what cooling solution you go for. So I wouldn't recommend that most people do that. But on the 2600X and 2700X with a stock cooler, you're most likely to get around 4 GHz on all the cores, which means that if you go into the BIOS and manually select all cores to that 4 GHz speed, in single-thread applications, the only active core will be limited to 4 GHz when it can actually boost to 4.3 or 4.2. So for Ryzen systems, I just leave it up to AMD's automated overclocking software called XFR, or Extended Frequency Range, to adjust the speeds for me. But if you really want to overclock, you should get an aftermarket cooler to gain performance in all the areas. Intel chips, though, generally have much higher overclocking headroom. Plus, you do have to buy a good cooler anyway, because Intel K chips don't come with coolers. So, I'd recommend setting all the cores to at least the maximum turbo frequency. Now, the charts just shown can be directly applied to heavily multi-threaded applications like video encoding. Games, though, are a different story because each game uses resources differently, depending on the game engine, your computer's hardware, and even the graphics settings that you use. The higher clocks of the Intel chips mean that if you are not GPU limited, you will get higher frame rates. But this only applies if you are CPU limited, because most of the time at higher resolutions and detail settings, your GPU will be the one holding your frame rate back. Take a look at this chart. You'll see that at 1440p max settings, the frame rates are pretty much the same across the board. In this situation, you'll have to get a better graphics card to get more frames per second. But if you turn down the resolution to 1080p, and whoa, now we're talking! The Ryzen system gets about 120 frames per second while the Intel systems reach 140. I actually chose to buy an 8700K for this reason. In addition to some AAA titles like Black Ops 4, I also play Flight Simulator X and OMSI 2, both of which heavily rely on single-threaded CPU performance and use very little of your GPU. Our computer before the 8700K machine had a first-generation i5-760. Yeah, that thing topped out at 3.33 GHz. On FSX, my frame rates used to be in the low 10s in the Kai-Tak area, sometimes even dipping below 10. Now they're in the high 30s to low 40s, which is good. FSX is known to be difficult to run at good frame rates. On the multi-threaded side of things, having more cores and threads don't really affect your average frame rate. However, games are already starting to use 12 threads, like Black Ops 4 and Battlefield 1. So while an i7-9700K may get you a higher average frame rate on these games than a Ryzen chip, because of the lack of threads, the game will stutter more on the 9700K than on the 2700X and even the 8700K. It's even worse on the 9600K and 8600K with their 6 threads. While it is true that most games right now in November 2018 don't use 12 threads yet, they're headed in that direction. In the future, an i7-9700K, which has 8 threads, may not be able to play games that smoothly compared to a 9900K with 16. Here are some charts showing the price to performance in single-threaded and multi-threaded workloads. Let's talk about multi-threaded workloads first. The performance per dollar of the Ryzen chips are much higher than the Intels, with the 2600X being the best value, followed by the 2700X and the rest of the Intel chips. You may have already noticed I have a performance per dollar figure for overclocked and stock systems. If you look closely, you'll see that Ryzen's value actually decreases when you manually overclock those systems. I said earlier that if you wanted to overclock your Ryzen system, you should get an aftermarket cooler to gain performance in single and multi-threaded workloads. In that case, the Ryzen chip's performance per dollar decreases. To be fair, even with a $100 aftermarket cooler, they're still better value than the Intels. For single-thread performance per dollar, the 2600X takes the lead again, followed by the 2700X. The 9600K offers the best single-thread performance per dollar out of the Intels, followed by the 8600K, the 9700K, the 8700K, and finally the 9900K. So who should buy these CPUs? Before I answer that, I want to emphasize that these are just general recommendations that will apply to most people. I believe that parts should be scaled together, so if you want a mid-range graphics card, I'd say buy a mid-range CPU. I generally advise against spending less on one part to get more of another, except in extremely specific scenarios, because then the system becomes imbalanced. But if you think you need to spend less or more on individual components, then by all means. Tailor your computer to your needs and your budget. Now, on with my recommendations. Are you building a system with an RTX 2080 Ti? Yeah, get the 9900K. If you have the money for a $1,200 graphics card, you should be able to afford a $600 CPU and then some for its cooler. Think about it. $1,200 for a 2080 Ti, $150 for 16 gigs of DDR4 3200, a $200 Z390 motherboard, $150 for a 500 gig NVMe SSD, $100 for a modular 80 plus gold power supply, a $200 case, and $100 for a 280mm liquid cooler. $300 extra for an i9 9900K is justifiable at this price point. What about if you're not going totally top range, but are building a mid-range to high-end system, like with a GTX 1080 or 1080 Ti? Are you aiming for 144 FPS in AAA games at high detail or better? Do you play CPU-bound games like Flight Simulator X alongside AAA titles? I say alongside because if you're only playing those types of games, you don't need an i7. You don't even need an i5. Get an i3 8350K and overclock that thing to as close to 5 GHz as possible and you're good. But if you play those games alongside AAA titles, or if you want to reach 144 FPS in those AAA games, you'll need the single core speed of the Intel chips. I'd recommend you to get the i7-8700K. The 9700K, in my opinion, is just stupid. At this price point, you're not going to be upgrading your CPU for the next 5 years, so you'll want something that holds its performance for a long time. Sure, the 9700K is great now, maybe even a little better because of its higher turbo clock. Remember, 4.9 compared to 4.7. But pretty soon, you'll wish you got the 8700K. With its extra threads, you'll have a smoother gaming experience for longer, while performing pretty similarly to an i7-9700K in single and multi-threaded workloads. The 2700X and 2600X, for that matter, can't quite manage 144 FPS in AAA titles because of their single-core speeds. They're really only good till about 100. And in those CPU-bound games, like FSX or OMSI, the frame rates won't be as good as the Intel chips, which is important because they're not great to begin with. If these don't bother you though, and you're not building a system with an RTX 2080 Ti, then yeah, definitely get a 2700X. It's a great performer and an amazing value for the money. Here's a pretty interesting alternative for the i7-9700K and i9-9900K. If you want your gaming computer to double as a professional workstation for content creation or 3D rendering, for example, check this out. The Ryzen Threadripper 1920X for $420. This is about the same price as the i7-9700K, and you get 12 cores, 24 threads, and a max boost of 4.2 GHz with XFR, AMD's automated overclocking software. This thing will game reasonably fine since its single core speed is kinda close to the Intel chips, and it will destroy both in multi-threaded workloads. You also have 64 PCI Express lanes compared to 40 on the Intel platform, so you can put more devices like NVMe SSDs or multiple GPUs if that's your thing. It also supports 128 gigs of RAM with 4 memory channels compared to 2. I really can't recommend the 9600K though, for most people, for the same reasons as the 9700K, except that it's already happening right now. We're at the point where many games have moved past 6 threads, so the 9600K's gaming performance is only going to decrease with newer games. Multi-threaded performance also leaves something to be desired, and at $280, it's pretty darn expensive for a mid-range chip, especially considering that with an aftermarket cooler, you're looking at $330 at least, which is similar in price to a Ryzen 7 2700X, and $100 more expensive than the Ryzen 5 2600X. I understand if you absolutely can't afford an 8700K and you need the single core speed of the Intel chips. Get it if this is your situation. But if you want a more balanced, longer lasting system and you don't need the higher single core speed of the 9600K, skip that and buy a Ryzen 5 2600X and save your money, or spend it on other components. Thanks for watching, guys. If you liked this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to my YouTube channel. Please also remember to hit that bell icon to be notified of any new uploads that I make. If you didn't like this video or had any criticisms, please write to me either directly or down in the comments so I can continue improving my content for you guys. Thanks again.